so that I can put insert my sleeve into the shirt. Now I'm going to do this with the flat method. So that means that I leave my sleeve flat and I go ahead and stitch the armscye seam. Then when I'm finished doing that, then I'll come back and stitch the sleeve seam and go all the way down the side seam of the shirt, all in one seam. Now that's called flat method or flat insertion for your sleeve. And the reason I can do that on this men's shirt is because it's got a very low sleeve cap. See, here's my bicep line. Look how low that sleeve cap is. And that's because the shirt hangs, the seam, this armscye seam of the shirt hangs down onto the arm a little bit of the person wearing it. It's not like a set-in sleeve that has a really sloped high sleeve cap because it fits really snugly along the joint where, or the line basically where your arm joins your body. This one is loose because it's a little bit looser under the arm and it's a little bit lower on the shoulder, off the shoulder seam. So the first thing I'm going to do is E-stitch. Okay, and I'm going to E-stitch between my notches. Now when we E-stitch, I'm going to turn this up to 3 millimeters so I get a bigger stitch. I like to E-stitch at 3 millimeters and baste at 4 millimeters. That's just a good rule of thumb for an average weight fabric. So I'm going to E-stitch from notch to notch so that when I put my sleeve in, it will help to it will help me to put this outward curve into the inward curve from the sleeve into the garment. Now if you E-stitch right on 5/8, which is exactly where you need the E-stitching, sometimes it might show on the right side of the garment, then you have to take it out. So I like to do a thread's width away into my seam allowance. So it still E-stitches it right next to the 5/8, but it usually does not show on the right side of the garment. But that's hard to do a thread's width away. So what I do is I line up my shirt to 5/8, then I take my needle and I move it 1 notch towards the raw edge. And then now I know I can go ahead and use the guideline for 5/8, knowing that I'm about a thread's width away into that raw edge. So that's the first thing I'm going to do is E-stitch right along the edge of the armscye between the notches. Okay, all right, I got that. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do to prepare my sleeve is I'm now going to do some basting. So I'm going to now go up to 4 millimeters. Okay, so I'm on the 4 millimeter stitch, and now what I'm going to do is I am going to stitch along this entire edge, not just between the notches, but along the entire edge of the armscye at a scant 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so a scant, that means a little bit less. So if you look here at your machine, you've got your markings like 5/8, 1/2 inch, 3/8, and then the next bit, but then your feed dog is in the way, but that next little line here is actually 1/4 or 2/8. So we have 5/8, 4/8, 3/8, 2/8. So if I take my fabric and I go in there, now I've also got my needle with one click or whatever in towards the raw edge, so it's just barely inside. So again, if I line this up to my 1/4 of an inch and I keep that needle just barely inside, then that will give me a nice scant. Okay, so I think I'll do that. All right, so now the other thing is from the needle to the very edge of the foot, that also is a 1/4 of an inch. So I'm gonna look at that, but it's just barely more than a 1/4. So if you like to line up your needle to the edge of your foot to get a 1/4, then you're gonna have to go 2 You're gonna have to go in twice. Okay, we gotta move our needle up. So you have to go in, oh, it did. Yeah, then you have to move your needle in twice. And, okay, now I'm gonna take, I don't wanna get this gummed up, so I gotta take it out and start over. So if I do that, if I moved it twice, and then I put my needle down, let's get that right there. Then when I put my foot down, now I am a foot away. I'm sorry, I'm a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of that foot. So what I've done is I've moved my needle over twice. So sometimes that's a little easier to gauge your sewing, your edge by, than this little tiny kind of mark right in there. So I'm gonna go ahead with that mark, and that looks good to me. That's a nice scant. And see, now I can keep this right on that edge. See, knowing that I'm a scant of a 1/4 inch. Yep, yeah, so, but you want to keep it right on that edge. Otherwise, because if it goes beyond that, then it's going to be too wide. And it's important to be accurate here. Okay. The other thing that I could do is keep it right on the edge of this, the opening part of the foot. And sometimes that's even a little easier because it's a little easier to see and line up your fabric too. So anyway, there's a few little tricks you can do, but what you want to do is be a scant 1/4 of an inch. Okay, I'm going to move some threads here. Okay, there we go. Now, because we're basting, we're going to end up pulling up that basting, so make sure you leave your thread tails, okay, on the basting and on the E-stitching. Okay, so now I've got those 2 rows in. I'm ready to pin my sleeve to the garment. Okay, so I've got my E-stitching, my basting. Now I'm going to put it on the garment. So here is my shirt, and as you can see, I've got the right side up. Here's the pocket, here's my edge stitching on my yoke, so I've got everything facing up, the right side facing up. So now what I'm going to do is take my sleeve, and I'm going to put the right side facing down. Notice this has got the placket in it, so I've got the placket all finished, and this is the right side. So I'm going to start pinning it together, right sides together. Okay, all right, so I'll start down here in this corner, and I'll get that corner all together, and I want to pin it right about where I sew it. And then I've got my notches here. Make sure you've got your single notch to single notch. That means you're putting the front part of the sleeve to the front part of the garment. Okay, and then I've also got some other marks where I want to use. I've got the very top of my sleeve, which is the shoulder dot, and I'm going to put that, match that up with the very, where the shoulder seam is on the yoke. Now this yoke actually goes onto the front a little bit and then down the back. So that means the little notch that I did on the yoke to show where the shoulder seam goes is right here, and I'm going to match that up with the shoulder seam of the sleeve. That's a very important dot right there at the top of your shoulder, so you want to match that up. I also have another dot that I did a little snip on the front of the shirt, and I did a little snip here on the sleeve, and those match up. Okay, because remember, we're putting an outward curve to an inward curve, so it's kind of tricky. Now this edge matches up just fine, so I don't need to pull up any easing there. It seems to be working good there. But from here to here, can you see how the sleeve is bigger than the garment? So that's where I've got to take my ease, and I've got to kind of pull it to try to condense the yarns right there. Okay, so I'm just gonna pull a little bit of that, use the thread to kind of pull that fabric in, and see how I've condensed the yarns here. I'm gonna sew so it'll be smooth. Then it does cause it to ripple a little bit on the outside edge. So I've got to pull it a little bit more up. So I grab that ease stitching thread and I come in here and I just pull this along until I can ease that up. Okay, all right, I think I've got it. Okay, see how that was able to condense those yarns right where I stitch, so that now the little bigger edge fits the smaller edge. See, now this has to come up over the shoulder, which is why it needs to be a little bit bigger. And again, it's the outward curve on the sleeve. See the outward curve on the sleeve to the inward curve of the garment. So that's a little tricky. Now I've pulled it up. I don't need to pull it up so much on this side. So now I kind of smooth it out again, so I don't need all that extra. Okay, so I've got that going. Now let's go ahead and stitch the other half of this sleeve. And so I've got the mark here with this mark, and that's called the balancing dot. And that just helps you to put the right amount of ease into the sleeve where it needs to go, so that it's balanced on your shoulder, on your arm. Okay, and then I'm going to match up the double notch here. That means the back. I'm pinning the back of the sleeve to the back of the garment. Double notches are always the back. And then I'm going to come over here. Now, because it's an inward curve and an outward curve, sometimes those edges don't match perfectly on your seam allowance. We don't care about that. What we care is that it matches up at the 5/8, at the seam line. So I match that up good. And now I'm going to keep your raw edges together, and I've got it matched up here good as well. Okay, now let's see. I want to make sure that I pulled some ease on the other side. Let's see how we're doing here. Okay, see, this is a little bit bigger here. So I've got to pull a little bit of ease up on this side. So I'm going to come over here and just slide that ease along here a little bit, so that it can help to again kind of condense those yarns, so that it will, a little smaller size will fit a little bit bigger. Okay, all right, so I think I've got that. Okay, now if I have any extra ease, I try to pull it out, because I don't want any gathers or any pulling right there. Okay, that's good. So that just pulled that ease up just enough to get this nice and smooth right here. Okay. Okay, again, you got to keep your raw edges together. They have a tendency on that sleeve to want to slip up and be higher. We don't want that. Okay. And we want to also smooth this out good, so that we don't get bunching or little folds or little gathers. Want it nice and smooth. Okay, I think we are ready to go ahead. I've got this all pinned, the armscye, and see how nice that looks, and it's not bunching, it's just fitting in nice and smooth. Okay, so I'm going to go and stitch that at 5/8. Okay, so I'm now ready to sew the armscye seam at 5/8, and I just wanted to show you here. See how the seams match up nicely here, but if I turn this over, can you see how the edges of the seam allowance do not match up? They don't even match up down here. I don't care about that. Because they're different shapes, they're not going to match up, but where I do want them to match up is right at the 5/8. Okay, so now I'm ready to put that in at 5/8, and I just got to get that needle. Oh, now, before I do this, I have got to redo my needle. See? There. Remember how I moved it over? Now it's on 5/8. Okay, good thinking. I didn't want to forget that. Okay, so get my needle in there. I always put my needle down first, right where I want it. Then I go ahead and put the foot down. Okay, so we want to backstitch a little bit there. Okay, and then I'm just got to keep this nice and smooth where I stitch, and I keep it right at the 5/8. Okay. Okay, now I forgot to do something. Look at that. I'm basting. It's on 4 and I don't want it on 4. So you know what I'm going to do before I go any further? I'm going to put my needle back, my stitch length back to regular stitch length because it's on basting. And then I'm going to hurry and take that out and start over because I basted instead of stitching. So that's a good lesson of what not to do. And it's easy to happen because you just easy to forget to reset that. So unless you turn your machine off and start over again, you know, it's gonna stay right where you left it. Okay, I'm ready. Okay, now I've got this. I just want to make sure that matches up good again because I took that pin out. Okay. I thought those stitches were kind of big, kind of long. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, we'll keep that at 5/8. Okay. With this E stitch, I want to be on the other side. Remember how I moved it over? Just a thread's width away. So I want to be on the, I want that E stitching to be between my regular stitching and the raw edge. So I don't have to worry about taking it out. But if it shows on the right side, then I've got to take it out. Keep this nice and smooth, even though I've condensed my yarns with that E-stitching. Again, you want to keep this nice and smooth so it doesn't even look like we had to E-stitch it. Almost finished here. Okay, all right, back stitch. Okay, all right, so we've got this sewn. So now we're going to do a little bit of trimming and then I'll tell you how to finish it. Okay, so we've got this seam sewn. This is the wrong side. Here's my sleeve, here's my garment, here's my shirt. So now what I'm going to do, because this seam is actually going to end up in a welt seam. And so we're going to finish the top stitching on the garment side, on the shirt side. So now I've got to trim this seam. And if you remember the welt seam from your jacket, you trim the one seam down to 1/4 of an inch. Then you take your other seam and you fold it 1/4 of an inch, and then you lay it over top of the other seam. So that's what we're going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shirt side. Okay, so I'm going to grab my seam allowance on the shirt side. Make sure you get the right one, and make sure you don't trim your shirt. You only want to trim the seam allowance. You got to be careful. So I always put my fingers behind it. Okay, so that I know I'm just getting, I always put my fingers kind of right here, so I know I'm just getting the seam. Okay, and we're going to trim this shirt side to 1/4 of an inch. Okay, and I'm just going to eyeball this because I've done this a lot. And also this this 1/4 inch that I'm doing here right now is not as critical, I should say, as other times. So I'm not going to measure this every step of the way, and you don't need to either. Just go ahead and trim that down to 1/4. But if you don't know where 1/4 is, then yes, measure it, because if you look on your ruler at what 1/4 is, it's like that much. It's not very big. So go ahead and trim this, and again I just put my fingers right behind it. After you sew this seam, you want to make sure that you didn't get any tucks or anything. All right, so I'll check and make sure I didn't, but I would be able to tell if I did, but we can look at it. Okay, so now where I go over the yoke, I'm actually cutting 2 layers, because the yoke is 2 layers. Okay, so there again, there's my 1/4 inch. Okay, so every once in a while, if you just want to check yourself with a ruler or a tape measure, or a seam gauge is good too. But I don't have a seam gauge with me right now. So, okay, there we go. So I've got the one side trimmed. So I should probably, let's look and make sure everything looks really good. See, everything's nice and smooth along that seam. We don't have any little tucks. If you get a little tuck, just unpick it a little bit, like an inch around it, or a little bit above, a little bit below, and just resew that one area. Okay, so that looks good. All right, so now I've got that part done. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the tailor's ham, because I need a good curved edge here. And then I'm working on the inside of my shirt, and I'm going to take my seam allowance here on the side I didn't trim, which is the sleeve side, and I am going to fold it right along my basting. Remember, I did that basting at a scant 1/4 of an inch. So now I'm going to take my iron and I'm just going to press along there. Okay, all right, and I'm just going to make sure that now I've got a notch here, and that notch is too long. It's going to get in the way, so I had to get rid of that. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, and again, I'll just, now I'm going to need to pull up some of that excess fabric. Okay, eventually. Right now seem to be doing okay with just pressing it. So I'm not going to worry about pulling the thread of the basting stitch to tighten it up. But I will. I'm going to have to do that. But let me just go ahead and finish. We'll do some pressing right here. Okay, and this helps to put it over the ham because it's a curve. Okay. And our bodies are curved and has shape. And so does this little tailor's ham. A flat surface sometimes can be hard to work on. Okay, so here we go. We'll just keep this pressing. Okay. This is one of the more difficult steps of this shirt. So if you can get this sleeve in looking good, then you just treat yourself to an ice cream or something, because this is a little bit tricky right here. Okay. Okay, let me just keep pressing that edge. Okay, we're doing good. We're just about got this. Then I'll show you how to pin it. And the pinning is critical. And if you get it pinned good, then the sewing will come much easier. Okay. All right, so we got that part done. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take that folded edge and we're going to lay it over top of this seam. Okay, and we're going to do that right along inside the shirt. And I keep pulling this out just to make it nice and tight and straight. Here, I'll just put the pins over here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pins. Now I have these really nice skinny pins. They have glass heads, they're really sharp, and they're really small. So they're not big, heavy, dull pins. That makes a big difference. And so then I just stick that right along the folded edge, and then I bring it up like that. Okay? And I'm just going to do that all the way along here. Okay, and what I can kind of hear it piercing the little tailor's ham. And then I, kind of back it off a little bit and then finish. Because I want it to go through all layers. So I kind of put it in there, or I'll lift it up a little bit knowing I've got it. Okay? So see, now on this side, then you've just got to make sure that this is nice and flat right here. You don't want to bunch this up. Okay, so I'm going to keep pinning this all along here. And again, I kind of pull it like this so I can keep it nice and smooth. Okay. A tailor's ham is a good investment for your sewing. But these are we had these special made for us, and so they're larger. The ones in the fabric store are often really small. So if you look around, maybe on the internet, you can find the little bigger ones. But it's wool, usually, and cotton, and sawdust in the middle. So you can even make your own if you want to try that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and finish pinning this, and then we'll come back and we'll stitch on that edge. Okay, so I have finished pinning this seam, and I want you to notice a couple things. Look how many pins I've put in. So I put in quite a bit. Also notice how I put my pins in where I take the tip and I go down to where I want to sew, and then I bring it up and through. Okay, so I take this small little bite. All right, so I've pinned it really well. And so from the other side, if I just want to check it, I can just check and make sure that, that I don't have big bunches of fabric bunched in here. It's nice and smooth right here. So I think I'm ready to stitch. All right, so now that it's all pinned, let's go to the sewing machine and I'll show you how to stitch that. Okay, so I'm now ready to stitch this seam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch on the inside of the shirt, and I'm going to stitch right close to this folded edge. But on the right side of the shirt, I've got to make sure that my stitching is the same width all the way along. So if I've done a scant quarter at my basting and I've turned it under at the basting, that means I should have slightly more than 3/8 here on this folded edge. So you want this seam to be 3/8. That's ideal. Sometimes it gets a little smaller than 3/8, and that's okay if it's a little smaller, but keep it the same width. So how are you going to do that? Okay, well, I'll show you a few things I do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle right here on this edge. Okay, so it's right, okay, so I've got my needle down, and then I'll put my foot down. Okay, now the other thing I'm going to do is to grab my tape measure, and I'm going to make sure that my needle, I'm going to look to see, kind of gauge everything so I get it all the same. So if I keep it right here along the edge, then I should be even on the right side. And if this is all 3/8, if I've been consistent here on this 3/8 and accurate, if I've been really accurate on my 5/8, first my 5/8 seam, then my scant 1/4 inch basting, then it's going to be 3/8 all the way down. So I'm measuring it, and I was like, yep, 3/8. Now right here where I started, it might be a little, I don't know, it's measuring 3/8 all the way down. So that means, and see, I usually put it on the 1, so I don't have to worry about that. So 1 right here, see, that's exactly 3/8. This is 3/8. So I've been really consistent on my 3/8 so that I shouldn't have a problem. Now the one thing that I didn't maybe explain so well is when I get into this outward curve, I might have to pull up my basting to help this to fold under. Because I ironed it good, it actually folded under pretty well. But that's what you can do, is pull up your basting. Okay, so I am ready to start. And I've noticed too that on the outside, if I keep the outside of my foot on the left side, right inside my stitching, then I am, gotta make sure, yeah, then I should be pretty good on my stitching. So I'm just gonna go ahead and stitch on that very edge. Okay, and I'm back stitching here. Okay, and then again, now I'm gonna go slow. This is not a race, and I'm going to go a little bit and then stop and reposition. Okay, so right here along this edge again. So I just make sure I'm right along that edge. Don't fall off the edge. Now I've gone a little ways. I just want to make sure everything is looking good. Yep, it is. All right. Okay, so here I'm at a pin. Sew to your pin, then take it out. Don't take it out before. Okay, so see, I'm right on that edge. And again, I gently pull these layers apart so that I don't get bunching on the right side. Okay. Okay. So see, I don't go very far before I stop and redo things. Kind of just get everything nice and perfect and smooth. Okay. All right. Okay. Again, you can kind of see how I'm trying to keep this seam apart. And at the same time, I can gauge and see that I'm about, the same distance on that side. Okay. Now the way we're doing this seam is how they do it on dress shirts, men's dress shirts that they buy. at the store, and so you are learning a very high quality technique. And at the store, they would call this single needle tailoring, which means this is the second time that we're stitching along this seam. And each time I did it with one needle. Well, of course we did, because we're sewing at home on our machines. But in the industry, they could have done this in one step with one machine. But if they do it with one needle all the way along the seam, then it's called single needle tailoring, and it's basically is higher quality. Okay. Now I'm going across the yoke. Now when I go across the yoke, I've got those two layers, so it's a little bit tricky, but you just go slow and get your stitches where you need them to be. And some students have to do this a couple times to get it right, but I'm a believer in do each step exactly correct, and then you're usually good to go. Like measure accurately, stitch your seams accurately. I happen to have a really high quality cotton Oxford. The little plaid is driving me crazy, but other than that, and so because I have a good high quality fabric, then it makes a difference in my sewing. Okay, I could feel that pin. I went over that pin and it hit it. What that will do, it didn't break my needle, but guess what? Probably dulled it. So I gotta be more careful that I don't stitch over my pins. These are pretty small, fine pins, so I don't often hit a pin, but I could tell I did it there. Okay, there's my back stitching. And now let's see how it looks. Okay, so now we're looking at the right side of the shirt. The good news is, it looks good. All right, so I got it good. So if you look here, can you see my stitching now? So can you see how it's consistent here? And so it's consistently about 3/8. It might be slightly less, just to, like, let's look right here. Yes, it's just slight. It's like a 1/16 inch less than the 3/8. So that looks pretty good. And I got this nice and smooth, so I don't have big, you know, a big bubble here. And so, and I'll press this really good, but see how nice that looks, nice and even, and looks good. So I want to show you on the inside. See, this is how it turned out on the inside. See? So you can see it's right along the edge there. I've caught all my edges. Everything is turned under. And on a dress shirt, on a man's dress shirt, there are no raw edges anywhere, because they usually wear them a lot and get them laundered a lot, and so there's no raw edges. So see how nice that looks right here? I might go ahead and take out my E-stitching, because it seems to be pulling just a little bit right here. And that will kind of help to smooth it out. But there it is. And there's the right side. Now I need to press it good. So I'll press it from the wrong side, or use a press cloth on the right side. But see how nice that looks? Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, and just to let you know, the next step will be to now sew my side seams and my sleeve seam all at once. And on that seam I'm going to do a flat filled, but on this one we did a nice welt seam.